People who have no idea about life after death experience deep distress at the loss of loved ones. For them, life loses its value, and some even consider leaving life. Immersed in grief, they believe that the departed are forever dead and feel nothing. But is this really the case? This question was brought to the attention of the German physicist Werner Schiebeler more than 40 years ago. Werner Schiebeler believed that grief, like any other emotion, causes certain thoughts in a person. These thoughts affect the grieving person and affect other people. But can they affect the deceased person being mourned? To answer this question, Werner Schiebeler has collected dozens of examples of how the grief of the living affects the departed. According to Werner Schiebeler, many people are convinced that after death a person ceases to exist or feel anything. The physicist was surprised that even some priests hold this opinion. One day Werner Schiebeler discussed this topic with one of them and heard such a revelation. There is nothing more terrible than death. It is the total annihilation of man's existence through God. Werner Schiebeler objected to the priest. The end of life represents the end of one period of our existence and the beginning of another. We move on to another world where we face new challenges. There we can no longer lead the same way of life, but is that a catastrophe? What prompted Schiebeler to speak so confidently about the existence of life after death? According to the physicist, this is indicated, for example, by the possibility of establishing contact with the dead under certain conditions. With the help of these contacts, we can not only get some idea of the conditions of the otherworldly life, but also learn about the experiences and feelings of the deceased. According to Werner Schiebeler, research in this direction shows that our thoughts can reach the dead, cause them joy or sadness, contribute to or hinder them on their way. In support of this, the scientist gave several examples. Such situations were described by Dr. Raymond Moody, who is convinced that thoughts and prayers about a loved one influence the dying process. Moody cites cases in which hopeless patients claimed that the prayers of their loved ones prevented them from passing away, Werner Schiebeler noted. Moody was told about one such episode by a woman named Joan. This woman's aunt was ill. For years she had struggled with her illness. Joan looked after her aunt. During this elderly woman's last days, all of her relatives prayed for her recovery. Several times my aunt stopped breathing but was brought back to life. After another return, she told me, "I was in a place where I felt good. I wanted to stay in that world, but your prayers keep me here." My aunt convinced me not to ask for her recovery again. The next day, she was gone, Joan recounted. The following case was described by the medium Maria Silbert, who lived in Austria at the end of the 19th century. Quite often at the séances of Maria Silbert appeared official Mr. Winston. He was seriously ill. And when Mr. Winston stopped coming to the sessions, Maria Silbert realized that he was no longer alive. Soon Mr. Winston made his presence known at one of Maria Silbert's séances. He was worried about his 60-year-old mother and asked to be invited to a séance. At it, Mr. Winston conveyed this message for his mother: "Do not cry for me, because your thoughts bring me back to physicality, and it is difficult for me to free myself from it." From Werner Schiebeler's book, The Effect of Grief on the Deceased, at this séance, Mr. Winston also conveyed a message through the medium that read, "Don't do what you plan to do. By doing so you will further distance yourself from me, your soul will take a different path and end up in sinister lands." Upon hearing this message, Winston's mother tearfully said, "I understand the message. It turns out the mother of the deceased was about to pass away. But the message she received from her son comforted her. After that, the woman became a frequent guest of Maria Silbert. Werner Schiebeler described these and other stories in one of his articles. He called it "Your Grief Will Touch the Dead." In this article, the scientist said that every thought we have about the dead acts on them like a phone call. If these thoughts are imbued with grief, they can long disturb the soul that has left the physical body. After this article was published, the scientist began to receive letters from readers who told of similar situations from their lives. One of the letters was written by Gertrude Riesch. Her husband died in June 1990. Gertrude Riesch's husband died at the age of 65. Gertrude was left all alone. She had no relatives or children to support her after this loss. Every day Gertrude Riesch traveled to the cemetery to talk to her husband. The woman returned home in tears. So a month passed, and her grief did not lessen. One day in July, Gertrude Riesch was returning home along a familiar road. On her way she saw a small shop. Some force impelled her to approach the window of this shop. Behind it, one magazine caught Gertrude's attention. The woman bought it. When she got home, Gertrude Riesch saw in that magazine an article entitled "Your Grief Will Touch the Dead." The woman read in it that our grief affects our dead relatives and becomes a heavy burden for them. Gertrude Riesch was impressed by this article. She tried to cry and grieve less for her husband. This story had its own continuation. One day Gertrude Riesch was awakened by the creaking of the door. It was about 4 o'clock in the morning. Gertrude woke up and thought she was dreaming. There was no one else in the house but her. At that moment her husband appeared in Gertrude Riesch's room. Though it was still dark, she could see his face. She held out her hands to him, but he moved away from her. And then he disappeared. It seemed to Gertrude that this was her husband's way of saying goodbye to her. He said nothing. In her letter, Gertrude Riesch told me that she still found it very difficult to overcome her grief and let her husband go, despite this experience and her newly acquired knowledge of how grief affects the dead. Werner Schiebeler said that such cases indicate that the personality continues to exist after death. According to the scientist, after earthly life, a new stage of development begins for us. However, this does not mean that the deceased immediately get rid of feelings from their previous life and the memory of those left behind. They feel our thoughts. And if those thoughts upset them, they are drawn to the earth. In that case, how should those who lose a close relative behave? I am not at all calling to forget about the dead. Remember them with love and wish them all the best in their new life. And ask for this in your prayers. I also don't recommend going to a medium to help you make contact with the deceased, because you can never be sure that you are communicating with the person you want to communicate with, said Werner Schiebeler.